Before Richard Prescott, chairman of the Coalition of Ordered Governments, initiated the planet-wide Hammer of Dawn strikes that would go on to destroy the whole planet save for the small area that sat on the massive granite slab humanity believed to be impenetrable, Prescott first needed to make sure, as far as his conscience was concerned, that he was within his constitutional right to declare martial law across the entire cog. He would do so by invoking the Fortification Act, which not only placed all of Sera that was under the rule of the cog under martial law, created nighttime curfews, lobbied all able-bodied men into the military to help fight the locust threats, and introduced rationing. Later, the same act would be expanded to give the cog Department of Conscription legal rights to recruit all the former stranded into the military and place women who couldn't give birth into non-combat positions such as pilots, medics, control operators, as well as further forcing women who could give birth into what would later be referred to as breeding farms, where their sole purpose in life was to help repopulate the human race following the end of the war against the locust. That last part jumps a little bit ahead of time, so instead what I wanted to redirect your attention to is back to the idea of Prescott having constitutional rights to enact the Fortification Act. The matter of invoking such a law from the start was a massive deal because the coalition was never one central government. Instead, it was more akin to a loose federation of alliances, with the nation of Tyrus, the nation Marcus Phoenix and Dominic Santiago were born in, serving as the main nation within the cog, with Tyrus's capital, Ephira, operating as its headquarters. The chairman was of course found within Tyrus and the city of Ephira, but a vote of all nations had to be taken into account before a law can be brought into effect. In the case of the Fortification Act, specifically, it placed all nations under the cog under martial law, and thus a refusal to recognize it or abide by the chairman's decree meant that any nation who refused to acknowledge such a law was now at war with the cog. Due to this, when the Fortification Act was declared, it created a paradoxical moment of all nations essentially fighting Tyrus. In theory, it thus created a death of the coalition and a massive civil war. But of course, that never happened thanks to everybody being hyper-focused on the locust. However, one could say it was an act of selfishness on the tyrant government to essentially make the decision of sacrificing everyone in order to save itself as the last hope of humanity in the sole remainder of the coalition. Today we're going to be going over the known history of the cog up until eday, going over its creation, laws, regulations, and known countries, cities, and secret government facilities such as Azura, Vectus, and the infamous Mount Kadar. Since the day humanity has come to be able to properly record history, the geography of the planet of Sera has done nothing but created a state of constant fighting on the single landmass of the planet. All of its inhabitants seem to have been on the brink of nearly wiping out the entire human race in a quest to assert dominance over each other. This period has the least amount of information on it apart from history later referring to it as the Age of Armageddon, which lasted roughly a millennia. At some point, the fighting during this period reached an apex, with many coming to denounce the destructive ways of war and outright dismissing warfare as a concept of accomplishing anything. The mental shift would thus trigger the next part of Seran history known as the Age of Peace and Prosperity. This era doesn't have an exact time frame on how long it lasted exactly, and I think it's safe to say that halfway through it, or towards the closing chapters within this era, humanity began to slowly warm back up to the idea of warfare as a means to submitting others to one's will, because by the time the next era, known as the Silver Era, was ushered in, humans began to utilize swords and chariots as the primary means of warfare. It was during this period of dominance by the sword that two primary nations rose as the main powers on the planet. These two nations were the earliest founded on Sera that were still existing when the cog would rise. These nations were Qashqar and Goraznia. Both nations would come to establish mighty empires that not only incorporated their own natural borders, but went on to expand into neighboring lands. As it seems to be part of the custom of two mighty world powers, Goraznia and Qashqar would eventually start engaging in a war of dominance over the other. These two fought each other aggressively over a number of centuries. At the height of both, Goraznia boasted a massive population of over 400 million people within its borders, while Qashqar continued to grow, using the many silver mines found within its territory to continue to build its own empire. Thanks to these silver deposits, it funded a modern army, capable of meeting the numerically superior Gharaznian army head-on, stopping them from invading and seeking the silver mines within Qashqar. That same silver would also go on to build impressive architecture and beautiful buildings that would go on to last for centuries. Although for this history specifically, the most significant of these projects was the construction of the city of Anvagad, and the military fortress within it that would come to be known as Anvil Gate. Anvil Gate's construction was a testament to just how impressive Qashqari engineers for the time was. It was naturally built into a cliffside. It utilized tunnels as a means to feed and hospitalize wounded within the city, as well as redirecting water from a nearby river that flowed aggressively non-stop as a means of powering both Anvagad and Anvil Gate. Little by little, thanks to the geography of the land and just how the natural elements worked with both Anvagad and Anvil Gate, Qashqar came to realize it was quite useful at stopping invading armies. Situated on a mountain pass overlooking the plains from the south, no invading army could ever hope to penetrate through this fortress. In fact, as time went on, the only thing ever done to the fortress to keep up with the advancement of modern warfare was just funneling in cannons and heavy artillery as a means to knock out armored vehicles and artillery. Nonetheless, at this point between Qashqar and Gharaznia, Tyrus as a nation was non-existent, although what would later be known as Ephyra, its capital, was now nothing more than a village and homes made out of animal manure. As time went on, and centuries continued to pass, Gharaznia slowly declined. As its strength waned, its borders slowly receded back to where it was naturally, and its population dropped from 400 million back down to just 20. It's believed at this point in time, Tyrus is now its own nation. Its government at this time was described as a militaristic monarchy, and it was keen on establishing its place within the sun. It wanted to do so by conquering, oddly enough, the South Islands. It's a curious decision since most fighting was on land, and thus empires were built out of fighting one's neighbor. So I wonder if it was a decision to slowly test their own military or just to expand without triggering a war with a much larger and stronger neighboring nation. It doesn't sound like the South Islands ever had much of natural resource to bolster the tyrant economy or help in any meaningful way. But the South Islands were an archipelago located within the middle of the expansive Serrano Ocean, and from some sources it's said that around 2 to 3 parties all fought over the South Islands, so it could have been a proxy war of sorts. No matter, these events would go down historically as the Archipelago War. While the tyrants ended up victorious and colonized the defeated South Islanders, their ferocious resistance to all invaders and the invading nations' aggressive response to it would forever change Seran history. For starters, the South Islands were shelled so heavily, many landscapes were completely annihilated by the sheer number of artillery shells that littered the area. Trees were completely destroyed and vegetation gone to the point that some regions were left uninhabitable for years to come. The destruction of the South Islands would be the catalyst for several men to come together and look into a way of replacing the modern order of doing things. These men would later come to be known as the Allfathers, the founders of the Cog. So while that mental change was taking root, Sera was again beginning to enter another era. This would be referred to as the Era of Silence. It's named as such because almost no wars were fought whatsoever. Most conflicts were resolved peacefully, giving various aspects of society such as culture, science, and arts a chance to properly evolve and grow. And thus, some people began to refer to this period as a golden era, and that was despite civil liberties and social issues still being a major problem as a whole. As time went on, yet again though, while many nations remained at peace, a major issue continued to rise to the forefront of many nations. That issue was energy. Sera's sources of petroleum and nuclear fuel wasn't enough to meet global demand. All traditional sources of energy, such as hydroelectric, solar, wind, and geothermal, wasn't enough to help remedy the strain on the global energy field. In the midst of this energy crisis, it would be none other than Dr. Helen Cooper, who would be identified as the person responsible for first looking towards emulsion as a possible source of energy. Prior to her looking at emulsion as a source of energy, the scientific community actually did nothing but regard emulsion as a curiosity of sorts. It was a well-documented element found abundantly within the underground cavern network underneath the surface of Sera that was referred to as the Hollow, but that was just a natural occurrence, not one that they believe they can turn into anything really useful. But thanks to Dr. Helen Cooper's determination in applying emulsion as an energy source, she would end up finding a way to turn this curious abundant source into a seemingly limitless, inexhaustible energy. Through her own process that would come to be known as the light mass process, the exact details of how this technique to refine emulsion is conducted was a closely guarded secret of Helen's, but given some time, she would go on to perfect this light mass process. And the results, in the end, did turn out to be quite successful, yielding massive quantities of renewable energy. This new replacement for traditional resources such as petroleum and oil was then quickly marketed to the masses as being a healthier and much safer alternative to the more traditional means, which has long been waning in its effectiveness at resolving the world's energy crisis. Recognizing the sheer amounts of money to be made within this discovery, a number of corporations would rise to claim their stake within this race of dominating the world's energy supply, some of which would come to be known fairly well during the events of the Gears of War games over a century later. Lithia Company Limited was known for operating massive facilities similar to the Lithia Imulsion facility within Tyrus located just west of Ephyra. Mercy Fuel was a more localized energy corporation, most likely a subsidiary of a much larger player, but it was responsible for supplying refined fuel directly to the town of Mercy. Later on, there would be Griffin Emulsion Company and its rival, Lopus Energy, was also founded. But as I said, those are a little bit later within the timeline of events. For the time being, the nature of emulsion replacing petroleum and working within motors in a combustive way similar to gasoline within engines helped ease the transition in vehicles from gasoline to emulsion, and so had the results of much of Sera happily accepting this form of fuel to aid in its transportation. However, slowly there was another issue with the world transitioning to emulsion, and that was due to emulsion being promoted as clean and limitless energy. It was rapidly creating an overhaul to the entire energy dynamic without elements of said system being able to properly adapt in a reasonable amount of time. Not all nations had the ability, or in some cases even the infrastructure, to immediately accommodate this new change. And this was in the middle of visionaries endorsing their countries to just adapt and accept this brand new resource, regardless of how backwards or far behind certain parts of their country were, and failing to take into account any damaging or harmful effects of just accepting this new fuel. Throughout the following decades, a more selfish nature began to come into play within the governments of Sera as well. Countries began to slowly compete against one another in an effort to acquire increasingly larger portions of international emulsion reserves. This generated the final era before the time of the Pendulum Wars. This era would be referred quite simply to as the Gold Rush. It was coined as such because the drive to acquire the emulsion against another nation created an unprecedented economic boom. Nations that possessed significant quantities of emulsion, primarily Qashqar and pellets, greatly enriched themselves, which those more eagle-eyed in politics noticed had the effect of creating an imbalance of power. Tyrus specifically, on the other hand, seen a massive economic boom that hadn't seemed to slow down since the discovery of emulsion as an energy source. But in the midst of this gold rush, a leading contemporary philosopher feared the potential side effects of this influx of material wealth within Tyrus would do nothing but continue to degrade the population's moral compass. Afraid of this continued moral collapse he was witnessing within Tyrant society, Alexei Desipech wrote an anthology of political volumes commonly referred to as the Austere Canon. The Austere Canon, in short, was a philosophy written that revolved around 8 concepts. These concepts were order, diligence, purity, labor, honor, loyalty, faith, and humility. The point was to reestablish these virtues within Tyrant society and help combat against all the corruption and selfishness Alexei was witnessing destroy his people. This is significant because even though it had limited mass appeal initially, it was thanks to the Austere Canon, those who read it and reached positions of power within Tyrus developed a bit of a messiah complex as they believed it was the duty of tyrants to be at the center of a new international order. Austere Canon even inspired the creation of a small political party based off the ideas expressed within the pages of it. Eventually, this small political party would go on to achieve significant influence within the estates of the aristocratic dynasties that dominated crucial political, economic, and military positions all across Tyrus. Some of these notable aristocratic families would end up being referred to as some of the founding families within the COG. These were separate from the Allfathers, but just as important because without their help, the COG would never end up becoming the organization it was, or even Tyrus developing into such a place where law and order were abided and fiercely respected. Some of these known aristocratic family names were far less known, like Lytton, for example. Others were well documented, such as Prescott's and Stroud's, but the 2 biggest of which were the Phoenix family, Marcus's ancestors, and the Baird family, ancestors of Damon Baird. Prior to the writings of the Austere Canon, these aristocratic families usually kept themselves tightly guarded within mountainous strongholds. Now that the mental shift and moral duty of Tyrus was evolving, the financial situation behind it was also beginning to change. These rich, influential families who were becoming even richer thanks to the flow of Imulsion, were beginning to openly finance public projects that helped support the virtues outlined within the Octus Canon. Monumental metropolitan areas were built, including the newly identified capital of Ephyra, which continued to be expanded upon. The city of Jacinto was also constructed, and it's seen its own period of economic growth, as it was a vital economic hub for the whole Tyran economy. Next was the Tyran military that's seen its own revival. Believing it was Tyran's beliefs that needed to help shape the rest of the world, and knowing the world only ever understood the strength of one's military, the Tyran military began to rapidly organize and modernize. The earliest of these newly trained and equipped divisions were two that would go on to forever mark the strength and power of Tyrus' military. First of these two was the Duke of Talon's regiment, which would, during the Pendulum Wars, witness some of the fiercest fighting against the Republic of Goraznia, where both Goraznians and gears from the Duke of Talon's regiment alike were accused of torture, starvation, humiliation, and various other war crimes against their enemies. The other unit was the 2-6 Royal Tyrant Infantry. The 2-6 RTI would later come to be known as the Unvanquished, thanks to its members' fierce determination to never surrender. They would meet their enemies in the harshest conditions possible, and more often than not, still somehow come out victorious when everything is stacked against them. The 2-6 RTI would also be famous for the sheer number of war heroes trained within it. Names such as Victor Hoffman, Ty Calisto, Dominic Santiago, Marcus Phoenix and his father Adam, Anya and her mother Helena Stroud, and the list stretches far past 100 years of warfare from before the Pendulum Wars to during the harshest fighting of the Pendulum Wars to the closing of the Locust Era. It was here within the development of a modern, highly disciplined professional military, though, that the population of Tyrus was now beginning to increasingly question the outdated militaristic monarchy that ruled over Tyrus. The open questioning of its outdated establishment, way of doing things, and thanks to the increase of Octus Canon's advocates overriding and bolstering the parts of Tyrant society they had individual influence over, all combined to help essentially abolish the ancient militaristic monarchy and establish a brand new democratic government controlled by the former aristocracy. As the whole planet continued to rely more and more on Imulsion, the natural occurrence of which became another point of wealth disparity. This disparity was best seen in one part of the world, particularly between two specific nations. These nations were Qashqar and Vasgar. Both countries were located alongside the strategic Eastern Central Massif, but the historic nation of Qashqar was discovered to be where 1/5 of the entire planet's natural Imulsion reserves were actually located. Vasgar, on the other hand, had little to no natural Imulsion deposits, so it relied on an extensive and highly vulnerable pipeline system from Qashqar to Vasgar to power its entire country. Between these two, Qashqar was the one who held all the power and control, and was also seeing a big financial boost thanks to so much Imulsion found within its territory, while Vasgar struggled to catch up or stay up on par with its neighbor. These types of imbalances that Qashqar and Vasgar were experiencing, dominating their own relationship and dependency from one nation to another, slowly began to pop up more and more throughout the international system. Political and financial resentment, favors, holding supplies as ransom, and so on, began to become an unspoken issue amongst nation to nation. Eventually, those with less natural access to Imulsion and more dependent on other nations began to be particularly hateful towards those with a significant amount of the revolutionary energy source. And so, during this slowly developing split, Tyrus would quickly position itself as a nation to benefit most out of these growing international problems. It rose as a political powerhouse, fresh off a new aristocratic-based government brought up off the Octus Canon. Tyrus, thanks to its own significant Imulsion reserves and now modern military, would frequently inject itself into the problems of other countries. The thinking behind this was it wanted to be seen as the sole country capable of keeping international order in check, and it would do so by securing the interests of its Imulsion-producing neighbors. The man at the head of the tyrant government at this time was Nasar Embry. Nasar's own personal belief was the world could only be truly united by enforcing order, and such a belief would inspire the creation of the Octus Canon, which we'll cover in just a second. First, I want to highlight Nasar's own desire to create his personal image of strength and order. He thought having such a strong, fearsome leader with a nation like Tyrus behind it that was now actively respecting and accepting the values of the austere canon, becoming to dominate the central thinking of most of the population, Tyrus across all levels of its society was now beginning to believe that its nation was meant to be head of a new international order. It was during this time that really shows the whole change from society to government and how Tyrus especially became proud for its military, which was a big thing during the Pendulum Wars that sounded to predate that period. Anyways, Nassar would be the first one to approach other nations to propose his idea of a supranational military alliance capable of at least, first, just deterring threats to the status quo. Part of his proposal was to make sure those nations who already controlled Imulsion continued to have a monopoly on it, with the only intention being a military threat or uprising would be met with the response of the richest nations in the world to come together and squash the rebellion, further enforcing the disparity of wealth amongst nations. The first of these countries to agree to join this international military alliance was Qashqar, Sarfuth, Dushin, and lastly Tyrus. Later, this military alliance would evolve into a socio-political collective where all nations involved consolidated their resources and came under one government, loosely one government anyways, at which point historically the leaders representing the first of these nations to found the COG, or Coalition of Ordered Governments as it was known, would be taught as the Allfathers. With the official formation of the coalition, the Allfathers would come together to bring in a new authoritative constitution, which is the previously mentioned Octus Canon. The Octus Canon was the founding document of the COG. Even though much of it was written by Nassar Embry specifically, it was very much shaped and revised by all of the founding fathers. Although, in short, it was undoubtedly Nassar's idea of a utopian society that tried its best to modernize the virtues of the austere canon that much of tyrant society was based off of. Now, because it worked as an explanation of what was believed to be of the duty of the citizens, and as well as outline how the decentralized nature of the COG's government worked, we're going to tackle this in 2 points. First, the population. The opening paragraph of the Octus Canon states, "I am responsible for myself and my actions. I shall conduct myself honorably and live a clean and frugal life. I have responsibilities to my fellow citizens. I shall be loyal to them and humble, because we are elements of a greater whole, and without them I am nothing. I have responsibilities to our society. I shall understand and respect my place in it, defend it, and work to make it prosperous, so that I may receive society's protection, and that we may hand on safety and prosperity to future generations." Needless to say, this oath is what was expected out of all citizens within the nations of the COG, and would eventually go on to expand and incorporate the population of member nations of the coalition that would later join, either through their own volition or coercion from the greater coalition. It obviously served as the affirmation of a citizen's promised allegiance and helped create this idea that they are all one cog within a massive machine marching on. Every person has a duty in place that needs to be achieved, otherwise the whole thing stops working. Now, even though the Octus Canon tried its best to incorporate the socialist principles outlined by Alexei in the austere canon, the Octus Canon favored more of a authoritarian culture and thus created a state that actually used these principles to support more of a reactionary ideology. Through heavy uses of symbolism, as previously mentioned, like a machine, the leaders of the coalition encouraged this communitarian ethos among its citizens and upheld this stratification of power. The mixture of reactionary and socialist ideals resulted in domestic policy changes that stressed the importance of absolute obedience to the state. This thus explains that due to their important roles within the formation of the coalition, the founding families, now an important and very powerful clique of aristocratic families, dominated the upper echelons of this new state. These new families that helped found the COG continued to control very important political, military, and even corporate positions all over the coalition, essentially allowing them to shape the political ideology of the coalition to their own personal tastes. The results, which could be felt most heavily in Tyrus again, was a powerful combination of authoritarian, industrialism, and militarism found deeply rooted within society and culture as a whole. Apart from the population and making sure one's citizens obey the rules of the government, the political aim of the COG outlined by the Octus Canon was established under the belief of a single unified, well-ordered government was the only way to stop Sera from continuously devolving into this chaotic cycle of war and peace, with each era slowly pushing humanity further and further towards the brink of extinction from its own hands. Ironically, as we'll see, the very creation of the coalition and its hope to protect the stronger nation's monopoly on Imulsion would do nothing but help facilitate one of the most disastrous eras in human history known as the Pendulum Wars. Speaking of each nation, though, we must remember the COG was, in essence, a decentralized government. So even if it acted as a one single governing body to outsiders, it was anything but. The Octus Canon, built from the motives of leaders that would come to be known as Eight All-Fathers, representing the 8 main nations of the coalition at the time of its introduction, made sure every single one of these 8 nations still preserved its national independence within its own existing structure. This granted considerable autonomy over their own internal affairs, even if the outward appearance of all their citizens began to have the same morals, values, and belief system when it came to the government. To make sure these internal affairs or issues with outsiders didn't come to affect the overall status quo or intentions of the greater coalition, all leaders of the COG's nations served within the Council of Sovereigns. The council is not to be confused with the House of Sovereigns. The former is referred to as the actual legislative branch and its assembly members, while the latter is the actual building. They would convene in to discuss various matters from alliances, interests within the capital city, problems or issues within each individual member state's international order, and of course voting on certain actions to be taken or left alone. It was also through the House of Sovereigns and voting from the Council of Sovereigns they would select an executive from amongst their ranks. This executive, picked by majority of votes, would come to be known as the chairman. Interestingly, in the earlier days of the coalition, the chairman actually had very little power. The sole purpose of the role was to serve as a mediator between various heads of states and oversee the implementation of their decision as far as the legislative branch allowed him to do so. As the coalition formed, wrote out its new constitution, and began to believe in this idea of unification through strict order, the rest of the world continued to be pushed further and further towards the brink of war through this economic imbalance created by Imulsion. The global economy was beginning to crumble, leaving just a few nations with access to natural emulsion unscathed. Those nations without Imulsion faced an economic collapse and complete ruin. It's never said which nation or who attacked who first, but from what I can gather, one of these resource-poor nations decided to attack one that had massive amounts of emulsion within its reserves. This triggered this chain of events that led to what we now know as the Pendulum Wars. Now, it's never said at what point the COG's rival known as the Union of Independent Republics, or UIR, was established. Whether if it was well before this initial attack took place, if it was a direct response to the idea of the coalition forming out of these resource-rich nations, or if it was created after seeing a potential heavy military response from all the COG members get involved in this initial attack. Whatever the case, the UIR became the response of all the resource-poor nations to the coalition. Thinking the COG was nothing more than the richest nation's formation of continuing to enrich themselves and subject the poorer nations to their will. Now, while I just said the poorest nations came together to form the UIR, not all of them were actually poor. The independent Republic of Pelis, for instance, was far from starved of emulsion, actually joining the UIR with vast stockpiles of the resource, and was considered a very aggressive opponent against the COG during the entire duration of the Pendulum Wars. From what I was able to put together, it even sounds like Pelis was the nation to take the initiative in first establishing the UIR, which is interesting because then it means that a strong nation like Pelis potentially rejected joining the COG, hated what the COG stood for, or just was out looking for itself. During the closing years of the Pendulum Wars, the premier of Pelis was the one who had to make the final decision of the UIR's surrender, so it's also quite possible the position of premier evolved over time, as would the position of chairman within the coalition. Whatever the case, Pelis would be one of the biggest threats to the COG. We'll address Pelis and the greater UIR in another video. For now, as the Pendulum Wars geared up, I want to discuss the secretive projects the COG got underway during this time of war. The first of these projects is Vectis Naval Base. Vectis Naval Base was actually built before the COG. The coalition instead repurposed it as a place to research biological warfare. For someone who didn't know any better, the whole thing was very unique because, again, during the Pendulum Wars, little to no fighting took place out at sea. The COG Navy was often considered much of an afterthought, and Vectis itself was a small island within the lesser island chains out in the middle of the Serrano Ocean, so it didn't make much sense for any kind of base to be placed there. It would be somewhat known to house the Combat Information Center of the Navy and all naval procedures. The Admiralty House on the island contained the Coalition High Command for the Navy, and those a little bit more on the know knew that Vectis Naval Base was codenamed VNB. But even then, it was still a closely guarded secret. Slowly over time, this closely guarded secret would come to be known as Toxin Town, since it contained chemical weapons research and a development facility that did end up leaking here. The severity of this leak is unknown, but must be somewhat significant since it was coined Toxin Town. And also, despite this leak, the island was self-sustaining and would go on to have a nearby town established named Pelruan. Pelruan was created to help sustain Vectis Naval Base, and it would go on to reach a total population of 3,000 inhabitants. Though, as you can imagine, Vectis Naval Base was far from the COG's only secret or foray into biological warfare. Something that's barely discussed is that as the Pendulum Wars began to rage on, many within the higher levels of COG High Command and society began to fear the total annihilation of the human population. So, the COG began to develop many deep underground bunkers all over the coalition and stockpile them with food and supplies to help preserve the rich and important personnel within the coalition. We don't know how many or where exactly all of them were placed, we just know that they exist because these bunkers would later be referred to as lost causes when the Locusts invaded. It's not like underground bunkers can help against an enemy that burrows anyways. This notion of self-preservation would continue to remain and go on to be the reason behind the development of a facility known as Azura. Azura, similar to Vectis Naval Base, was an island out in the middle of the Serrano Ocean, located in the south of the Seran Hemisphere. Initially, all that was erected on this island was a monastery founded by Tyrant monks deep within Azura's mountain ranges. For the Coalition, it would come to mix the purpose of Vectis Naval Base and the already smaller, scattered underground bunkers into one location serving both purposes on a much grander scale. Azura was constructed around 53 years before eday, and this island was picked as the site due to its capacity to support a major defense effort. However, luxury was a primary focus in its construction since it was specifically meant to house the COG's elite. Politicians, bankers, military personnel, and scientists who were believed to be crucial in rebuilding humanity would all find their names on lists destined to Azura. One scientist in particular was crucial during Azura's construction, though, and that scientist was named Dr. Niles Sampson. Sampson was a tyrant genetics, teratology, immunology, toxicology, pathology, and virology expert. He became one of the most prominent geneticists in the entire world, with a specialty in teratology, the study of abnormalities or physiological development in organisms during their lifespan. In his profession, he maintained a prominent position under the COG's Department of Health. Thanks to him, the massive research facility on Azura was well equipped for anything humanity would ever need in researching any disease and cure it would ever face in the future without ever having to leave the island. He also helped create an AI made to automate the various systems all over Azura. Anyone who lived here would see and hear him in the moments they woke up to the moment they went back to sleep. Azura could have been Niles' crowning achievement had he not been called back to the mainland to oversee the darkest secret in all of the COG's history. That's the discovery of Rustlung. Apparently, it wasn't long after Dr. Helen Cooper's lightmass process was put universally into effect, the COG started to document emulsion-related sickness. While the world's population was still hearing the early discovery of this new limitless, clean, safer energy, scientists behind the scenes were slowly beginning to learn that was not true. This was a very dangerous resource that was making people extremely sick. Miners of emulsion and their families, and even families close to emulsion refineries and dig sites, began to cough up a rust-colored brown phlegm. In addition to that, other symptoms included troubled or labored breathing, chest pain, joint pain, weakness, hemorrhaging, loss of speech, hair loss, accelerated nail growth, eye discoloration, sterility, nausea, vertigo, insomnia, paranoia, and increased aggression. In cases where adults and their offspring were able to be studied, excessive exposure to emulsion resulted in children being born with birth defects. All of these horrible symptoms were rolled up under the single identifier of coughing brown phlegm. Rustlung was the official diagnosis here. Rustlung's discovery was extremely catastrophic on many levels. For one, the whole Pendulum Wars was being fought over emulsion. The world's governments have all promoted it as clean and limitless, but was slowly and brutally killing those who mined it, and it was affecting their children. Most nations with emulsion were also under the coalition of ordered governments. The fallout of Rustlung being known to the population could essentially mean the end of the coalition and maybe even throw the world back further as they search for a cleaner and more permanent energy source. The discovery hence would alter the balance of power and leave the fate of the COG unknown. Facing this crisis, Chairman Monroe of the COG would greenlight the opening of New Hope Research Facility. This facility was originally placed under the control of the health department, who then placed Dr. Niall Sampson in charge of it. Since the whole point of this facility was to allow the COG to further study the effects of rust lung, potentially look for a cure, and hide everything it was doing, New Hope was constructed to look like the Jameson Depot. Here, the children affected by rust lung would be transported and kept under close watch by researchers. Really though, New Hope was nothing but Niles losing touch with reality. He began to inject concentrated doses of emulsion into the children here. Many would die thanks to his experiments. But because he was noting, before the deaths of the children exposed to emulsion, some of their cells went under immediate stress and degradation, while others actually mutated. They began to believe rust lung could be overcome through intentional genetic engineering. And when a small girl named Mira was injected with the emulsion, Dr. Torres, who worked alongside Sampson, reported Mira showed no signs of cellular degradation from lethal levels of emulsion injected into her veins. Instead, her body actually benefited from emulsion exposure. It strengthened her immune system and slowed her aging down by 50% of a normal human child. Unfortunately, this discovery in Mira would lead to Niles desperately trying to recreate her genetic evolution in other children, but it just resulted in countless more children being killed. As the research at New Hope continued, many of the scientists and other staff at New Hope began to become disillusioned with the type of work they were really doing here. Believing it was unethical and unsafe, some thought Niles' behavior was pure sadistic, and so many would begin to resign. Following these resignations, leaks began to surface, and eventually Monroe personally investigated New Hope. When he learned of the unethical experimentation, imprisonment, and torture of children, he ordered the entire facility be shut down, and all remaining staff indicted on charges. Unfortunately, by the time COG authorities arrived at New Hope, Niles, his closest supporters, and all test subjects still alive were long gone. Having been helped by a fringe political syndicate within the COG, Niles was marched out to the Qashqar Valley, where, inside Mount Qashqar, he continued his research and eventually perfected the genetic engineering that created the locus. Meanwhile, the Monroe administration destroyed all remaining documents on New Hope and placed it under permanent quarantine. The only surviving document of it is a directive passed down from chairman to chairman only, and the only information within the document was to keep New Hope under quarantine and to never let anyone know whatever happened there, or the dangers of rust lung. Following the Monroe administration, which I'm assuming is a time period where the chairman began to obtain more and more power as a leading central figure within the coalition, effectively serving as its leader, we know of 3 other chairmen. There is David Prescott, the father of the later chairman Richard Prescott, who's in charge during the majority of the years humanity is at war with the Locust. After David and before his son Richard, there was Thomas DeYeal, who was chairman during the final years of the Pendulum Wars and the first year of the Locust invasion. Apart from knowing David Prescott served during the Pendulum Wars, there's really nothing noteworthy during his tenure, and Monroe's biggest contributions appears to be essentially greenlighting New Hope and trying to keep it all under quarantine. However, during Thomas DeYeal's administration, the coalition expanded its military substantially in 2 main ways. First was the introduction of Special Forces as its own dedicated branch. This came after decades of Victor Hoffman advocating such a branch within the coalition. Modeled heavily after the Pasang Mountain Fighters, the COG sounds to have been behind the UIR in actually implementing Special Forces, but having its training be combined with the skill set of South Islanders, who at this point in time held positions as skilled marksmen within the COG's army, they already went incredibly long periods of living out in the wilderness off of wildlife caught and skinned thanks to their own culture and tough upbringing of living out in the wilderness, complemented the intense stress put on silence and paying hyper attention to one's surroundings like the Pasang. Both helped tremendously put the COG Special Forces a notch above the UIRs, despite it being practically in its infancy. The other major advancement was thanks to DEO's approval of Operation Leveler, the stealing of the Hammer of Dawn technology from the UIR and using it against them. It would help put an end to the Pendulum Wars after 79 years of long, hard fighting. While both went down in COG history as massive successes, they were both controversial when they first were approved, reminding us that things that look to be no-brainers in hindsight aren't always popular within the moment. And then for Richard Prescott, we know he joined the military, but only served a total of 18 months strictly to help out his political career. So it's possible that as the COG continued, military service was considered either a requirement or a major plus within the eyes of those underneath the chairman. From the military, he would then ascend to the position as deputy chairman, and then ascend to the position of chairman after the death of Deil, who suffered a heart attack a year after the Locust invasion. I just wanted to take this moment to thank all of my Patreon supporters. Without none of you, these long deep dives wouldn't be possible. If you want to join the Patreon, support the channel directly, and watch everything I ever post without ads, the link is down in the description and pinned comment. Also, this is the first time I'm actually announcing this, but if you enjoy this type of content and have an interest in real non-fictional history, I just launched a history channel. Picture the exact same thing done right here on Cynic, but covering people and topics within our own real world. The format is a little different. In an effort to combat AI, especially within that particular niche that's running rampant, the format has changed quite a bit, but the premise is basically still the same. So if you're curious, interested in history, you just want to check that out and support that as well, the link to that channel can be found in the pinned comment as well as this video's description.